Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Brie, and in today's podcast, I'm going to be talking about the subject of third places, as well as the erasure of specific services that people have become accustomed to. Now, it's been a while since I actually posted because I have been sorting out some real life things. But now from February 9th, which is of course today's date, I am going to be continuing the 2-week schedule of podcast episodes. So without further ado, let's begin. So for some time, I've actually wanted to cover the topic of third places, mainly because it actually interests me, especially in relation to why third places are slowly being erased. Of course, considering that I am in my 20s, this particular topic has allowed me to reflect on what's changed in terms of the third places that existed growing up and what is left now. So a third place is basically somewhere you can go besides home or an institute or a place of work. So for the average person, you typically have 3 places that you would often frequent. So your first place is your home, where you eat and relax, or you just sit down and just be by yourself or with family or a partner. Your second place, that is if you're studying, would be an institute. So if you're a student, you would most likely spend more time at school, college or university. Or if you are in a job, you would spend more time at work. So looking at myself as an example, I work a full-time job, of course, as a receptionist for a local council, and I do 36 hours a week. So on Monday to Thursday, I am up from about 8:15, 8:20 in the morning. Fridays would be 7:15 to 7:20 in the morning. And of course, when it comes to my job, my shifts last for just over 7 hours a day, or a little bit more if I have to cover evenings. And the earliest I get home is 6 o'clock, which would usually be on a Friday. And the latest mostly depends, because sometimes I don't get home until maybe 7:30 to 8 o'clock, depending if I have to cover evening reception. And one thing I've noticed, I guess, as I've been working, is that most of my time, Monday to Friday, is of course taken up by my job, because I am in a site for 5 days a week. And of course, when you add in the commute, for me, it takes an hour door to door on a good day, or an hour and a half if I have delays. But the point I'm explaining is, for the average person, they do spend more time at work than they do at home. Now, the purpose of the third place, of course, is to have an area where you can just wind down, socialize and relax. And of course, by being in a third place, you can form communities and mix with individuals who can share similar interests to you. And of course, you can even go as far as forming long-term relationships. So, I mean, if, say, for example, you went to a library and you met somebody who is interested in fictional texts, you can easily meet up and have discussions over your favorite fictional books. Now, there are many examples of third places, which can typically include cafes, parks, pubs, gyms, town squares, restaurants, shopping centres, libraries, art museums, after-school clubs, etc. So anywhere where you could just relax, do an activity, or form a community would be an example of a third place. Now, since the lockdowns took place in 2020, there has been a decrease in third places, especially for specific demographics, which consist of children, preteens, and teenagers. Now, of course, in the case of these demographics, you don't really have many third places anymore. So, I mean, growing up, I have noticed that lots of stores, for example, that were catered to these demographics have actually disappeared. So for preteens in particular, for example, the only store I see near me is probably Claire's, which caters to that specific group. But otherwise, a lot of third places that do exist mostly cater to adults. Either that or they've been replaced with luxurious flats that have high renting costs or buildings which again are catered to adults. So, for example, there was a local cinema that I used to go to from childhood, typically with my dad. And this cinema was open for 10 plus years, and recently, as of last year, I believe, in July, it closed down and it's being replaced. And of course, when it comes to cinemas, quite a lot have closed. So the nearest one to me now is a little bit more expensive, especially considering that food is more than £3. And it's not to say I can't afford it, it's just a general observation. And the same thing does apply to, say, retail stores in which they close, typically because of lack of business or high rent costs. And one thing with third place erasure is that a lot of places that used to exist have online services now. So if, say, for example, you used to go to a retail store that you enjoyed and that store is gone, the only way you can still shop with them is online. And the thing with online shopping is that you don't really get that same feel of being in a store, obviously because you're just browsing for clothes or accessories on the internet. So the problem is that you don't get the opportunity to try on clothes, and if, say, you have an item that comes and there's a malfunction, it's very difficult to get the item replaced, it's very difficult to get refunds, and it's very difficult to get in touch with a customer service rep because typically everything is being replaced with some sort of AI. Now, in relation to the issue surrounding, third place erasure, the work-life balance has been amalgamated into one thing. So going back to the topic of the lockdowns, people often had to work from home if their job allowed them to do so. And of course, even though working from home has advantages like saving money on travel or food, so you don't have to constantly commute or even buy lunch on a regular basis, the main issue is that with the work-life balance, it's very hard to distinguish because you are bringing your work home with you and you don't have that opportunity to decompose after a long day because the separation between work and life no longer existed. Now, in the case of students, that is relating to the lockdowns, colleges and universities would often give them the opportunity to go into walkable campuses. So you would have various shops or places that you could browse. And of course, with lockdowns, students had to finish university courses at home. So, I mean, looking at myself, I graduated during the lockdown back in July 2020, and the experience wasn't really the same because I couldn't physically go to university or meet up with friends or go to shops because I could no longer do that due to lockdowns being put in place. Now, when it comes to going to third places, there are many reasons as to why a lot of people no longer go to them. And one of them, of course, involves financial issues. So before I get to that, I'm just going to have a sip of water because my throat is quite dry. Okay, that feels a lot better now. So going back to the topic, financial issues is of course one of the reasons as to why a lot of people don't really go to third places as often as they used to. So of course at one point when it came to cost of living, it was very easy, well not easy, but when it came to salaries, typically one person could support themselves as well as whole family on a single salary, even if the salary in question was minimum wage. Now, looking at the recent inflation and also the high rent, bills, council tax, and also high costs for necessities such as food, electric, water, etc., a lot of people no longer have disposable income once their necessities have been taken care of. So, of course, due to the high cost of living, it's very difficult for the average person to support themselves, let alone afford a night out or a day out with a friend. So, if, say, for example, you're going to a cafe, a lot of the cafes that exist, at least in the UK, are often chains. Places like Cafe Nero, Starbucks, Coaster, Pret, these types of chains are often seen in various places in the UK. So everywhere you walk, everywhere you drive to, everywhere you use public transport to go to, you will see one of these cafes somewhere in the UK. And with these cafes, the food and drink costs are just too much at times. So for example, I purchased a small hot chocolate today and it was £3.80, which was of course the cheapest price for that specific drink. My mum purchased a medium hot chocolate and that was £4. So basically the medium size was 20 pence more. And if, say, we were to purchase a cookie or a sandwich or something, we would find ourselves paying maybe £2.80 plus just for a little bit of food. And again, it's not to say we can't afford to do so, but not everyone has a lot of disposable income. And one thing to note as well is that certain places don't really allow you to just sit down. So again, using the cafe as an example, you can't just go in and take a seat. You have to purchase a food item or a beverage of some sort. Otherwise, not only will you be taking up space, but potential customers who want to eat in or drink in cannot do so because you're sitting there. And it's not just for places like cafes that have this issue, at least when it comes to the topic of finances. The same even applies to events. So if you're going to a concert, you could find yourself paying more than £100 depending on seating arrangements for a ticket. Now, I've been to concerts before and it's not something I do all the time. It's kind of a once in a while thing if I feel like it. So I've been to 3 different concerts and the most recent one I attended was for Pink Panfest last year back in February. And I think this was a week after my birthday, and I actually took the day off work to go because I think it was on a Friday or something. And I remember paying, I think it was up to £40 for a concert ticket, which was actually the cheapest I paid. And the most expensive concert ticket I've ever paid for so far was for Blackpink back in 2023. So I took a day off work to go. No way, it was on a Sunday actually, and I took a day off the next day so I could rest. And I remember paying over £200 just for the ticket alone. But then again, I chose to do so because I was the one that wanted to get like a VIP arrangement, if that made sense. But again, going to a concert is not something I do all the time. It's only when I feel like it and there are actual artists that I'm interested in. But again, the point that I'm making is that a lot of events like concerts do require you to spend exuberant amounts of money that you might not have at the palm of your hand. Now, even growing up in my teen years, there were many instances where I used to hang out with friends. And of course, looking back, one thing I noticed is every time I used to hang out with friends in my teen years, I would often spend a lot of money. So there was an ex-friend I used to hang out with. in the summer holidays in particular. And we used to go into a shopping centre, and we would often go to shops to try on clothes, souvenir stores, we would get food, and we had a couple of occasions where we would also just, sit in the car park and sort of loiter around. So one thing we used to do, which was actually quite fun, was going into a shopping trolley and just pushing each other around the car park for fun and filming it just for the fun of it. But again, one thing that came across in terms of when we used to hang out, if that makes sense, is the fact that we needed money. So every time I used to hang out with my ex-friend, my dad would give me up to 70 quid a day. And this isn't me joking around. My dad would actually give me up to 70 quid a day. And obviously I know this does make me sound like a spoiled brat or something, but if I needed cash to go out with a friend, my dad would be the person who would always give me quite a bit of money, or at least what was considered a lot in the mid-2010s. So I would get up to 70 quid a day, and I would mostly spend it on food or clothes because I needed cash if I wanted to get anything, and it was the same thing with my ex-friend. Now, in her case, because of the dysfunctional environment she grew up in, she never really had the opportunity to get as much money. So for me personally, I was kind of the person who would often pay for her stuff, and of course I didn't mind doing so, because if I'm friends with somebody, I am very genuine when it comes to paying for things for them, because I don't really mind doing it. So, we would sort of do things that way, or pool the money we had, and we would end up having just over 100 quid to spend in one day. And looking back, this sounds kind of bad, considering that I would blow money quite a lot in my teens, although nowadays I am more controlled when it comes to money because I prioritize my savings, which is a good thing. But this is just a general observation in regards to how much money was required. So, when it comes to finances, you do require money in order to get certain opportunities. Even if you want to travel, you need money to make ends meet. And the less money you have, unfortunately, the less access to opportunities or fun things or necessities you have. So going back to the topic of finance in relation to third places, I have already mentioned that it is very difficult for people to spend money because they can't afford to do so when visiting a third place. And this mostly applies for individuals who work minimum wage jobs or families who can barely make ends meet. Now, of course, I know how it feels to be in a position like that in a way, because I used to do a minimum wage admin assistant role, and I noticed that I barely had enough money as is. So that in its sense was kind of sad. And even in my old job where I used to work, I actually knew colleagues who would often struggle to make ends meet, let alone struggle to save money to go out, because again, due to being paid minimum wage like myself, they couldn't afford to do so. So once the necessities are taken care of, you don't have disposable income, and you have to wait until the next paycheck comes. So in terms of the demographic relating to this particular topic as well, third places, as I mentioned, for preteens and teenagers are non-existent. You used to get shows that would air on TV, like 16, for example, where you had teenagers hanging out after school or college in a shopping centre. So as a teen myself, I actually used to watch that show on a defunct channel called Pop Girl, and I loved the general aesthetics of it, especially because you saw the characters' personalities, you saw how they hung out, you saw what they did at work and all the exploits, etc. So of course, the point of the show was embodying teen culture and showcasing a sense of friendship. Now, again, as mentioned, a lot of shops that exist in shopping centres are catered to adults. So the only preteen stores you would get are either Claire's, as I mentioned, or clothes shops. It's the same thing for children as well. And with teenagers, obviously, again, you don't really have specific places catered to them. Now, of course, considering the job that I work in, which relates to youth offending, one thing I've actually kind of noticed is if teens don't really have a place where they can hang out after school or college, they are more susceptible to crime. Now, of course, with the job that I'm in, part of my role involves updating events posters on the coffee tables and the notice board so that young people can see the different activities that they could potentially get involved in. And one thing I notice is as hard as I try to update the posters, a lot of young people don't really seem to pick them up. And I think it's because there's not enough promotion in terms of activities that are available. Or in most cases, most activities are for things that they're not interested in. Because, I mean, not every young person wants to do construction or go into music. And it's not to say those are bad things, but a lot of people want to do different things. And if you don't have variety, this kind of goes into a bigger issue in a sense. Now, another thing to notice regarding why third places are lacking is, of course, the takeover of the internet. So looking at the internet in the 2000s, it was actually a different time. So even though it existed, the main difference between the internet today versus the internet in that particular decade was the accessibility. So if you were using the internet, particularly as a teenager or even a child in the 2000s, you didn't really have access to it all the time. So growing up as a kid, when I used to use the internet, I would use it on my mum's old Windows XP computer. And even though I used it on a regular basis, it wasn't to a point where I would sit on a laptop or a computer all day, because I still went out to a park, I would still go to fun fairs, I would still have hobbies, and there were different fair places I could frequent. I mean, I even used to do after school activities. That was before my exams came in secondary school, and I had to kind of focus on that. But my point was, the internet in the 2000s didn't really have a similar level of convenience compared to today, because you never had many devices which had internet access. So if you go into the internet now, you can access it anywhere. So if you have a laptop or a computer, you have access to the internet. If you have a smartwatch or a smartphone or a tablet, you have access to the internet. You can even access it on a smart TV, you can access it on a smart fridge, you can access it anywhere. And of course, considering that the internet is easily available, lots of people don't really socialize in person, because nowadays you have social media, you have sites like Discord where you can communicate with people. So it's a lot easier to say text a friend or even do a video or a phone call. Another thing as well regarding the lack of fair places is, even though this doesn't relate to it as much, it's very difficult to actually spend time to do errands if you have a 9-to-5 job. So if you work Monday to Friday, a lot of services like banks, for example, often close early, and weekends are the only option in terms of getting shopping done because of the early closures. And for a lot of people, as I mentioned, online shopping practically dominates the retail industry. So now that you don't really have as many brick and mortar stores with various options, that is for retail, you can easily go on Amazon to find certain items that might not be in store. But again, despite online shopping being convenient, there isn't the opportunity to browse samples of items, as mentioned, and there are many issues in terms of sorting out disputes. Now, in the case of children and teens and exploring third places, there is also too much of a pressure for them to grow up quickly. So due to social media and peer pressure, you don't really have that awkward phase between your childhood and your teenage years where you can figure out who you are by exploring your identity. So obviously, when I was entering my teens, I was a very socially awkward individual because obviously I'm autistic, and even now I'm still socially awkward despite the fact that I sound okay when I try to communicate. So I liked gaming, I liked K-pop, I liked Vocaloid, anime and manga, and I had a very strange dress sense. So I would mostly wear jeans, tops and anime looking hoodies. So I remember I used to have 3 particular hoodies, one of which was a dinosaur hoodie from the now defunct David and Goliath store that I used to wear a lot to school, even if it was cold. And I would often have really messy hair that I would relax and put in a ponytail because I was very shit at doing my hair. Therefore, that was the only style that was somewhat bearable. And I also had a fringe in my teens and wore glasses that made me look more awkward. But the thing is that I didn't really care how I looked. I just liked feeling comfortable in the clothes I wore. And I often wore Converses as well. So most of the Converses I owned from my late teens and they still fit, which is kind of a good thing, I guess. So that's one thing that I noted about myself. Now, for girls in particular entering this particular phase, they are more influenced into dressing and acting like adults. So, I mean, you had the Sephora craze taking place in the US, for example, where you had these young girls under 13 going into stores, destroying sample products, and even going as far as making their parents purchase all sorts of makeup, things like bronzer, foundation, lipstick, mascara. And it's kind of sad in a way because you have these young girls trying to act as if they're older when really they are not giving themselves the opportunity to explore their childhood, let alone their preteen years. And I guess what kind of doesn't help is if you have specific interests, you have to kind of hide them because, again, there's this peer pressure in which if you don't conform to what the majority wants, you are going to be outcasted. So for a lot of girls in particular, I guess things like this will probably make them have mental health issues and also have low self-esteem. Now, of course, going back to the original topic of third places, it's very difficult to actually get to a third place if you live in certain countries. So as I am from a European country, I have access to walkable areas, which I'm actually very grateful for. So if I want to go to a shopping centre, the nearest one is literally about 20 to 25 minutes walking distance. And there are 2 options for shopping centres because there's a small one that's like 15 to 20 minutes walking distance, and then there's a larger one that's around 20 to 25. I can even walk to a park as well. So sometimes I do local walks to one particular park that I often frequent, but I do have access to quite a few options because there's one park that is about 10 to 15 minutes away. There's another that's like 20 to 25 minutes away when I'm doing long walks, especially with my dad. And there's another park which I could get to, which is probably like 35 minutes walking distance, which is great. And even stores like off licenses are near to me. And it's not just stores and parks and other forms of third places. I have access to public transportation. So, for example, the nearest bus stop is about 2 minutes away from me. The nearest train station is 7 minutes, which is one that I use on a frequent basis when I'm going to work. And that in itself is a good thing because I don't really require a car, although a part of me would like to have one purely because I can just have a vehicle I can drive anywhere to, especially one where I don't have to be in crowds of people, because even though I do use public transportation, I don't really like crowded areas because I get claustrophobic, especially when people are sort of touching you, mainly because I've had bad experiences where people have sort of touched me and things like that, even as a kid. So that's kind of why it would be nice to have a car. But going back to the topic, I keep saying that a lot, I'm so sorry. A car isn't really required if you have walkable areas. So I mean, in a lot of European countries besides the UK, you do have similar places where you can typically walk to stores or cafes and things like that. But if you live in a rural area, like the countryside or something, you would require a vehicle, typically because the nearest town is probably more than an hour away, and the same applies to stores. Now, in the case of the US, for example, you often have a lot of suburbs, so you will require a car, and if you don't have a driver's license, it's very difficult to go somewhere. So I had an ex-friend, for example, who used to live, I think, in California or something, and she would tell me that when she was walking to the bus stop to go to work, she would have to walk for basically 45 minutes because that was the nearest one to her, as she didn't have a car at the time or somebody that could drive her to that bus stop. And of course, if you're a teenager and you can't drive, it's even worse because you have to either get a friend to drive you to places, which isn't too bad if they're available, but if you get your parents to drive you to a place to hang out with friends, it might come off a bit embarrassing or something, especially because you don't have a car. And if you have a place that consists of roads and suburbs, you can't walk anywhere. You just can't walk anywhere because it's so difficult. And I guess this is why third places in general are either near non-existent or practically non-existent, which again is kind of sad to see. So yeah, that's pretty much my thoughts on the subject of third places and erasure of services. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. And as always, I'm very grateful for everyone who has supported me. And I do appreciate the comments and the feedback, especially because the more people that listen to this, the more grateful I feel. Now, of course, as always, I'm not doing this to make money or anything. I'm mainly doing this to share my experiences of being autistic, as well as interests in topics that I want to cover on occasion like this. So the next time I'll be releasing an episode will be on the 23rd of February after my brief time off work. And of course, as always, all episodes are released every 2 weeks on a Sunday. And the next episode I will be covering is about controversies on vaccines and autism, which is going to be an interesting one because there are people who believe vaccines cause autism and that there is a cure, which is absolute. So I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for the support as always. And until the 23rd of February, I will be off, so enjoy the rest of your weekend and I will see you soon. Goodbye for now.